Okay, so back in November, with the 14 Pro Max and Pixel 7 Pro fresh onto the market, we compared those against the Galaxy S22 Ultra with some pretty interesting results. But we knew Samsung was just months away from releasing an upgrade. I reviewed that last time against the other S23s, so check out that video if you've not already seen it. Today we'll be looking at the three biggest flagships out right now, and seeing how the new S23 Ultra stacks up against the best from Apple and the best from Google. With those massive performance improvements, it could well dethrone Apple as the smartphone powerhouse, and after some important camera improvements, could take away the Pixel's crown as well. This in-depth review will cover all of that, so let's see what's the best smartphone so far in 2023. I've made unboxing videos for all three of these already, so you guys already know what you're getting with each one. But even starting with a design comparison, we're going to cover a lot of the same ground as before, since the S23 Ultra is barely different from the S22 Ultra. I do appreciate the slightly flatter curve on the front glass. That's now closer to what the Pixel has, but I maintain that a flat display like the iPhone's is the best way to go. It does mean thicker bezels, and actually there's no excuse for Apple's to be this thick, so the Androids both clearly have an aesthetic advantage, especially when looking at the camera cutouts. The screen-to-body ratio on the Ultra is still the best, and with the biggest display as well, it's the most visually appealing from the front, whilst the iPhone is the least. I picked up the underrated white colours this year, but check out the previous video if you want to see how the black models look. And the reason I say underrated is just look how clean these finishes are. But something that gets often overlooked is how the lighter colours appear to have slimmer bezels. With black frames, these blend into the black bezels and make them look thicker, whereas these silver frames are clearly distinct, and actually it makes the bezels seem thinner and improves the aesthetic. If you're going to stick these in a phone case, you're not seeing that back colour anyway, so that's something to think about. Samsung still takes the win for choice though, offering basically double the number of colour options as the other two. Personally, I still think the Pixel wins for the overall design. I like the slightly rounded corners, the thin bezels, and the camera layout is more interesting than either the iPhones or the Ultras. I still wish it had a matte textured back glass like the other two, but for me it still beats the boxy shape of the Ultra and certainly the chunky bezeled 14 Pro Max. But that design component is completely subjective. You may have a different choice, so what about the practical aspects? Well, speaking of the glass, the new Ultra has Gorilla Glass Victus too, so that opens up a bigger durability gap over the Pixel, though it's still unclear how exactly this compares with the iPhone ceramic shield. Apple might still claim it's the toughest out there, but you'll find drop tests online showing either can be the winner. I still give the overall durability win to the Pro Max though, for its deeper water resistance protection, the structural advantage of having a flat display, and of course the stainless steel frame. The Android phones are both still aluminium. Moving on to ergonomics, there's firstly a size difference to consider. The Pro Max is the shortest and thinnest, so it feels the smallest in the hand. But it's also the heaviest, which does add a quite literal premium weight to the phone, but you'll also notice how heavy it is compared to the other two. The Ultra is the tallest, widest and thickest, and definitely feels the biggest overall, and then the Pixel, as the most narrow and lightest, is the most comfortable to hold and use. Having its buttons slightly lower down than the Galaxy makes those easier to reach as well, but the iPhone wins here for conveniently splitting them across both sides to avoid confusion, and for providing a handy physical mute switch. I should point out that US models of the 14 Pro Max are now eSIM only. You cannot put a physical SIM card in those like you can the other two phones. Now, it doesn't affect me personally here in the UK, my iPhone still has a SIM card tray, and actually I personally welcome the inevitable eSIM only future anyway. But if you're in the US and prefer a physical SIM card, you need to bear this in mind. One-handed accommodations will help you navigate these big phones, which on the iPhone are basic, with reachability simply pulling your content down to the lower half. The Pixel does this too, but has the benefit of some keyboard customizations like size and placement. But the Galaxy is in the lead with a completely resizable and movable window for one-handed mode. It also provides the S Pen, so despite being the biggest, it has that unique edge for assisting with navigation and productivity. The software is built with the S Pen in mind, with benefits like handwriting to text and air actions, neither of which are features I use often, but obviously neither the iPhone nor Pixel offer anything like this. The S23 Ultra's haptics are unchanged, which means they still place in third as the weakest. The iPhones are the most nuanced and arguably the best, but I still prefer the way the Pixel implements them. There's a stronger feedback when typing, for example, which ultimately makes them a lot more satisfying. You should also consider biometrics, because that's another key convenience and security factor that you'll be utilising every time you unlock your phone. It's close between the Pixel and Galaxy, both under-display fingerprint scanners work quickly and reliably, but the Ultra's is still a hair faster, and being ultrasonic, there's no need for a flash of light like the Pixel's optical scanner. The Pro Max on the other hand has Face ID, an undeniably convenient feature and admittedly still my personal favourite, but the cost is high because it necessitates that ugly cutout on the display. Reflecting on Dynamic Island 5 months later, it's become something you mostly just forget about, just as we did with the notch, a hill that will certainly seem far steeper for any Android users switching to the iPhone. Occasionally, I'm really glad it's there, and seeing it expand for notifications or tapping it for quick multitasking elements is great. Disguising it as a software feature is smart. The only problem is that under normal use, those cool interactions just don't happen often enough, and I'm not sure it's actually better than having a tiny hole punch and software that lets you genuinely multitask. Basic features like picture-in-picture and split-screening apps, which both Android phones offer. As for the display specs though, the S23 Ultra is unchanged from the S22 Ultra, so once again the Android phones both lead the iPhone with a slightly higher full 1440p resolution, whereas the iPhone has a slightly higher colour accuracy against the more vivid Androids. I found the Ultra's white balance was slightly cool and blue, the pixels were slightly warm, and then the Pro Max sat somewhere in the middle. You notice that the most when looking at whites. The Pro Max is still the brightest as well and the easiest to read outdoors, but it can trade blows with the Ultra, which I found typically looks brighter indoors with HDR content. The only certainty is that the Pixel clearly falls behind for brightness. The Pixel's 120Hz does feel the smoothest though, and I said last time that the iPhone was in a close second. Except when it comes to social media browsing, then the iPhone has a clear lead and is strangely far smoother than the other two. We've known for many years that those apps are just really well optimized for the iPhone. But thanks to the new smoother animations with One UI 5.1, I actually think the Ultra's caught up and it's now much closer. There are clearly things to like about all of these displays, and it might just come down to the overall aesthetic that sets your preference. But I think on the whole, the Ultra would take the win for having the highest screen-to-body ratio, and being slightly bigger as well just helps enhance that movie viewing experience. Something else that helps with that are the speakers, and last time around the Pro Max had a clear lead with bass and especially the top speaker, which I do think is still the case, and both Android phones don't have nearly as good stereo separation. The S23 Ultra does improve quite a bit from the S22 though, opening up a gap over the Pixel, so take a listen and hear which you think is best. So far, there's not been too much of a difference from the video back in November, but now we get to the performance section, which tells an entirely different story. I'll start off showing you the benchmarks, because this immediately demonstrates the massive gains for the new S23 Ultra. Okay, the Geekbench scores still show the iPhone coming out on top, so maybe it still holds onto the Speed King title. But when it comes to the graphics performance, the Ultra has gone from just above the Pixel to now beating the Pro Max as well. For years, Apple has proudly claimed about how far ahead its A-series chips are, but here we are with the Galaxy's custom-tuned Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 annihilating last year's S22 Ultra and now providing the highest frame rates and the best sustained performance. I noticed the Pro Max felt slightly warmer when gaming too, so the Ultra's heat management seems better as well. The Pixel still trails behind. Its Tensor chip just isn't designed for the super intensive tasks the other two are capable of, but that doesn't mean you can't still get a decent gaming performance out of it. It's going to be plenty fast and powerful enough for the average user with most tasks. It's just the gamers and video editors who want to consider the Ultra or the Pro Max instead. The iPhone is still lightning fast with load times and most processing. The harmonious relationship between Apple's custom hardware and software still shines through on occasion. For instance, here with making a simple trim to a 4K video, the Pro Max finishes in seconds and, well, look how far behind the Android phones are. So I want to give some deserved credit. But when it comes to gaming and other graphically demanding tasks, we have a new champion in the S23 Ultra. Best of all, now that Samsung has ditched Exynos, everyone is going to see this performance boost when buying an Ultra. So here are the hardware specs side by side, and realistically, the only significant difference is the storage. The RAM, for example, is pretty much even when you consider how it's utilised for each phone's software. The new Ultra now starts at 256GB of storage, which in the UK is actually where the Pixel maxes out. Storage does vary by region, but with no expandable storage options, you'll want to go for either the Pro Max or the Ultra if you're going to need a lot of storage. But here's a spec difference that you definitely will care about: the battery. This is another area where the S23 Ultra has seen a massive improvement over the S22, which completely changes the narrative from our last comparison. The Ultra was previously the weakest of these three, and the iPhone has dominated here for years, but now they're basically neck and neck. From daily use, their battery lives were almost indistinguishable, and even when I used them literally identically, testing the cameras, phone calls, streaming videos, gaming, they ended within a percentage of each other. So that's already a huge improvement over the S22 Ultra. These phones can display the battery percentage differently and the drop rate can vary, so I made sure to test these until they actually died as well. One thing is clear, the Pixel has the poorest battery life, and the Ultra and Pro Max each gave me a couple of extra hours of use. I wouldn't say it's bad necessarily, but it's not exactly a strength for the Pixel. The S23 Ultra defaults to a 1080p resolution, and I found that switching it up to 1440p, as I like to use it, it would then fall slightly behind the iPhone. I don't think overall it does quite enough to take the battery crown away from the 14 Pro Max, but seriously, the improvement over the S22 Ultra is pretty insane. With charging, that's unchanged from last time around, so the Ultra is still by far the fastest charging phone here. Even when you don't charge at the full 45 watts, the Ultra is just so much faster, with the Pixel trailing a little bit behind the iPhone. All three support wireless charging, but only the Android phones offer reverse wireless charging, though 5 months on from the previous comparison, I've still not needed to use that. I have, however, used the Pro Max's MagSafe. That's actually a super convenient feature I hope to see Android phones copy, because at the moment you have to pay extra for accessories to modify them to offer something like this. So it might be a slow charging phone, but the Pro Max is convenient in other ways. There's no charger in the box with any of these phones. It is 2023 after all, but our friends at UGREEN have a fast charger that's suitable for all three. I talked in the last video about their crazy 140 watt charger, but this Nexode 45 watt alternative is a more affordable option from that same family. It's a dual USB-C charger, so you can fast charge two smartphones simultaneously, and this UK version here has foldable pins that, along with the compact size, make it ideal for travel. It supports both power delivery and quick charge protocols and has a smart thermal management system built in as well. I'll leave links to this along with a discount code in the video description, so if you want to fast charge your new smartphone, then I'd recommend checking this out. When it comes to software, there's an obvious difference of iOS versus Android, and that's definitely one of the biggest hurdles for people to overcome. Typically, people like iOS for its simplicity. Its closed-off nature means it's less flexible, but it also has a fluidity and reliability that's second to none. Not to mention how seamless the Apple ecosystem can be, especially if you utilize features like handoff, AirDrop, and FaceTime. Android goes a different route, and is a lot more feature and customization rich, and Samsung's One UI really epitomizes that. You'd struggle to find a more feature-packed OS in fact, and the Ultra's One UI 5.1 brings a number of multitasking and connectivity improvements, including to Samsung DeX and improving Samsung's own ecosystem. The trade-off of course is what many consider bloatware in Samsung's duplicate apps, which I admit can be irritating, but it makes the Ultra a productivity powerhouse. The Pixel on the other hand runs the cleanest and most pure form of Android, and is centered around Android's greatest asset, the Google Assistant. It's the smartest on the Pixel and brings a number of quality of life features surrounding calls, speech recognition, search, and image processing. Ultimately, it's going to come down to personal preference and how you want to use these phones as to which OS best suits your needs. As always, you'd really need an entire video to cover everything, so do leave a comment if you'd want to see a deep dive on all the software differences. One important consideration is how long you plan to keep these phones for. Apple will serve you best here, not just because of the speed of the phone in a few years' time, but also in offering the greatest number of years of support with at least 6. Samsung comes in second with 4 years of support and 5 for security, and finally the Pixel will offer another 2 years of support and 4 for security. Okay, and now for the part most of you are here for, the cameras. Obviously spec-wise things are looking very similar, especially since the S23 Ultra only got a new main lens and selfie lens. It clearly outspecs the other two phones on paper, but how do the phones actually compare? Well, the image processing is the main difference. Samsung has moved back towards a more saturated, sharp and high contrast look, and that's the key distinguishing factor. The Pixel is also high contrast, but keeps a more realistic saturation level and is noticeably dimmer as well, whereas the iPhone has a much brighter exposure but the most natural contrast. It means photos on the Ultra are often very striking and vibrant, that sort of Instagram-ready edited look that lots of people enjoy but is not true to life. The Pixel's heavy contrast brings out a lot of detail and looks a bit more punchy, but those photos don't pop in the same way because of the lower brightness. It does really well with colours and white balance though, and if you want the camera that captures the most true-to-life images, the Pixel is still unbeaten. The Ultra's higher sharpness can work well to bring out detail, as the Pixel does through contrast. But what's nice this year is that it typically doesn't result in added noise, which the Exynos S22 Ultras were especially prone to. These ultra-wide shots show off some recurring issues though. iPhone shots are still plagued by a yellowy green tint, the Ultra shots are too cool in colour temperature and occasionally have a pink tint as well, and then the Pixel shots are noticeably dimmer, though they are still closest to the real life scene. It's interesting how you can often get an improvement when switching to the high-res mode. Now, the Pixel doesn't have this and uses pixel binning instead on its main lens. That's another key difference. But watch the Pro Max and Ultra photos change as we switch to the high-res shots. Immediately with the Ultra, it's like it disables Samsung's vibrancy filter that it applies to the regular mode. The iPhone is more consistent with its high-res mode, you just notice the reduction in contrast and sharpening. But the main thing I wanted to point out was the increase in resolution. Here are the regular mode photos, and now switching to high-res, notice how much sharper and cleaner those hard edges are, on the Ultra especially, but the Pro Max is not far behind. Here's another example, and in this shot of Lily, all three phones are actually a bit over-sharpened, but especially the Ultra, and again its saturated colours stand out. Its HDR is very good though, trailed by the Pixel, and then far behind is the iPhone, and Apple is often struggling with blown-out highlights at the moment. But switching to the high-res modes, the Pro Max improves with more realistic contrast and sharpening, and the more muted colours look the most natural of all. The Ultra retains a relatively high saturation and contrast, and sadly loses out on HDR now, but it heavily dials back the sharpening and allows the 200 megapixel resolution to take centre stage, which drastically improves the image. Cropping in, you can see just how much detail it can capture. The plane of focus is quite shallow with 200 megapixel shots. You can see how much more of Lily is in focus with the Pro Max shot, and I personally prefer the more realistic iPhone image. Those 48 megapixels show off, if anything, more detail. But the S23 Ultra closes the detail gap left by the S22 Ultra, and I won't deny that the saturated, striking look is appealing. I wish the Pixel had a more advanced RAW photography mode or let you use the full 50 megapixels, because this is an area where the iPhone and Galaxy are clearly both ahead. With portrait mode, once again we see the familiar saturation and colour differences, but notice how much the Pixel punches in for the 1x portrait shots. It actually ends up giving a much nicer blurred background. Because of this, the tele-lens portraits actually look better with the iPhone and Galaxy. The depth of field looks especially good on the Ultra, and I love how clean it is, but it is suffering with HDR. The Pro Max has actually done the best with the portrait effect, correctly filling in these tricky areas, and surprisingly has done the best here with dynamic range. The Pixel doesn't use the tele-lens but instead crops in further, so the portrait quality degrades and you should stick to 1x portraits with the Pixel. We'll look at zoom now, starting with the ultra-wides, and once again the Ultra is the most saturated in colour, but the white balance is consistently too cool, the iPhone shots are too green, and the Pixel has the best colour accuracy. At 3x, the Pro Max's tele-lens actually outperforms the Ultra, whereas the Pixel is digitally zooming in, but actually performs the best because of Google's great software. Its tele-lens only kicks in at 5x, at which point it now outclasses the other two phones. Pushing up to 10x, the Pro Max is really struggling now. The Ultra has engaged its secondary telephoto lens and looks great, but look how well the Pixel competes even at this range. The iPhone Max is out at 15x, so I've cropped in here to match the 30x maximum for the Pixel, but I've got to say that it's still doing a really good job. It's not quite as sharp as the Ultra, which strangely has increased the saturation here, but I think the Pixel should cover the vast majority of zoom situations. The Ultra's niche is the ability to zoom up to 100x, clearly annihilating the performance of the iPhone here, but I still think the Pixel deserves credit, and although the Ultra is the zoom king for range, for more common distances, the Pixel shots often look better. At the other end of the zoom spectrum we have macro, and once again the Pro Max shot is spoiled by a yellow-green tint, despite the detail captured being pretty good. The Pixel is also well detailed but darkens the shadows a bit too much, whilst the Ultra shows good colours and exposure, but it's actually smoothed over the texture of the earbud and has missed some detail, which the iPhone in particular has captured well, but it does depend on the subject. Here the Ultra is actually the sharpest and the most detailed by far. The focus plane is very shallow though, and quite clearly the colours are very oversaturated and the highlights overexposed. The iPhone shot is too yellow again, and only the Pixel has accurately balanced the colours. Low light is the area where the S22 Ultra last time struggled against these two, but the S23 makes serious gains here, and starting with these ultra-wide shots, is producing the cleanest night mode images and is able to bring out a lot more colour in this very dark scene. The Ultra's tendency to oversaturate actually comes in useful in poor lighting. The Pro Max is struggling here the most and lacks the sharpness and contrast of the Android phones. Switching to the main lens, again the iPhone hasn't exposed as much shadow detail, a typical more realistic approach, though arguably less useful. The Ultra sharpening appears to give the most detailed image here, so if you're just looking at these on a small screen, that'll be fine and it looks great. But if you actually crop in and look at the fine details, you'll discover that both the iPhone and Pixel are cleaner and more refined. The Ultra sharpening actually introduces a bit of noise to these objects, and the Pro Max has revealed the most genuine detail, and actually controls the highlights the best as well. In these shots here, I quite like how the Pixel's night sight gives the most realistic exposure for the real life scene, but it's the Pro Max with the most accurate colours. The Ultra is a bit too red here, despite having a nice and bright exposure. Zooming in, the Ultra and iPhone both reveal more shadow detail, and with the Ultra sharpening, we get more background detail as well. But this has added some noise to the night sky, which is too dark to notice on the Pixel and is much cleaner with the Pro Max. On the whole, they're genuinely tough to separate, but I don't think the S23 Ultra quite beats the iPhone when it comes to low light performance, and Pro RAW can take this to the next level as well, but it has significantly reduced the gap compared to the S22 Ultra. When it comes to video, it's a similar story to last year, and yet again the iPhone just can't be matched for smoothness and stability. It has the best colour accuracy too. The Ultras are overly cool, whereas the Pixels are oversaturated. I must say this is aesthetically appealing, just not realistic. It was disappointing to still see the dropped frames and stuttering from the Ultra's video. We spotted that in the last review, and although it's hard to tell here in a YouTube video locked at 25 FPS, in reality it's an issue that definitely needs fixing. I'll also freeze frame here to show the iPhone's autofocus advantage. It has excellent subject tracking, which results in sharper image quality, so it remains the video king for smartphones. With low light video, the Ultra has another weakness in a big ISO problem. This is surely an issue that Samsung is going to fix, or at least improve, because the attempts to raise the exposure are ruining low light video. Once again, the Pro Max has the cleanest looking video, it's the sharpest, smoothest, and has the least noise. The Pixel is doing a good job, but the image is clearly noisier, and if I freeze frame at the end here, you can see that the quality difference is very obvious. With the front cameras, there's a stark difference between the Pro Max's over-brightened approach versus the Pixel's dim exposure, and actually the Pixel selfies are the softest too, so the performance is quite poor there. The Ultra, interestingly, takes a clear lead though. With a much more natural exposure, it doesn't crank the contrast as much like the iPhone, and the sharpness and colour saturation is the best. With portrait mode, we see a similar difference. The Pixel can be really hit or miss with the portrait effect. I think the subject detection is the best on the Ultra, but like the Pixel, it does have sharper edges. So areas like my shoulders for instance can appear more natural with the iPhone, which tapers the blur into the background. But a lot of this is simply personal preference. Okay, so this is a test on the front-facing video for the 14 Pro Max, the S23 Ultra and the Pixel 7 Pro. I'll leave the sound in so you can hear the microphone quality, and I think the Pixel 7 Pro is the clearest microphone, but when it comes to video quality, it has the lowest resolution. I'd say the Pro Max probably has the best front-facing video because of the bright subject exposure, but mainly because of the autofocus, which is very good. But let me know what you guys think, which one has the best front-facing video. Each camera will suit different needs. The iPhone is still the video champ and has an excellent high-res mode with Pro RAW. The Ultra is the king of zoom, selfies, and now has a much improved night mode. But the Pixel remains the best at taking photos on the main lens thanks to the software, and offers decent zoom performance itself. The exposure can be a bit low on occasion, but you can easily brighten this later, and I think the advantage you have with a natural white balance and colour accuracy make up for this. So the Pixel's camera would be my personal choice for high accuracy, but you may enjoy, say, the Ultra's more stylised processing. So, which of these phones is the best? Well, as soon as you factor in the price, there's immediately one standout choice. The Pixel 7 Pro is simply far cheaper than either of the $1,000 plus Pro Max or Ultra. It's a big enough gap to forgive the weaker overall spec sheet, and it clearly offers the best value for money. The battery life and display brightness are the most difficult aspects to reckon with, but at this price I'd easily recommend it out of these three anyway. What's interesting is that last time I told you the 14 Pro Max was technically the most impressive phone, and it had a clear lead with battery life and performance, but the S23 Ultra, though a seemingly minor upgrade from the previous model, completely changes that. The Ultra's massive performance boost this year means that it now leads the performance category. The battery life is basically on par with the best, the display is the most impressive, the cameras are refined and improved, and it's the most feature-rich in both hardware and software. It might be the most expensive here, but it's also the most phone for your money. This time, you don't have to worry about getting an inferior Exynos model either. All S23 Ultras are powered by this extremely promising Snapdragon chipset. So ask yourself if you can really make full use of that to get your money's worth, or whether a phone like the Pixel is enough for how you intend to use it. It leaves the iPhone in a more awkward position, especially since Apple is so stingy with discounts, whereas you'll likely find even the new S23 Ultra discounted very soon. It's undoubtedly an impressive phone, and you might still want to choose it for the build quality, the bright display, and especially the reliability of iOS. It's the most future-proof option that'll last you the greatest number of years. As always, personal preference is the most important factor of all, but hopefully from this video you've been able to compare the key differences to help decide those for yourself. My personal pick is still going to have to be the Pixel 7 Pro. That design, those cameras, and Google's excellent software experience are what sells me. But I'd love to see them combine those aspects with a more advanced display and a class-leading processor for the upcoming Pixel 8. Let me know which of these three is your favourite, and if you think there's any other contender for the best smartphone in 2023. Do leave a comment with any questions you have, please like this video if you found it helpful, and don't forget to subscribe to see more content like this. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.